following through on a promise to build his grandchildren a space to play. A Henderson man discovers his newly purchased property holds priceless stories of North Carolina's past. When Ken Spellman first bought 2 acres of land on Satterwhite Point Road in Henderson, he had family in mind. A carpenter by trade, he made a deal with his wife.
I said, look, I'll remodel the house in 3 weeks.
Outside, he built this gathering spot for family. It was a swing set, zip line, treehouse, walking trail, and pond. Before long, neighbors in this rural community gathered here for family fun. It even attracted the family of the man who sold Spellman the property. Turns out, they also owned the plot next door and wanted to sell it.
And he said, hey, we've got a family cemetery on the property, and I really would love for you to have the property and preserve some of our heritage.
Spellman thought it was a good idea since he owns a construction company and needed to store his equipment. So he bought the home sitting on 14 acres of land next door and the sheds that came with it. But then Spellman didn't expect the owner to say this.
He did tell me that there was a slave graveyard or a slave buried somewhere on the property. He was kind of vague about it. They described it as rocks turned up that was stuck in the ground.
Once Spellman bought the land, his crew got to work, clearing trees, debris, and poison ivy to cut this trail connecting the 2 properties. And that's when the unexpected happened.
I actually found 40 to 50 stones.
Each stone represents an enslaved person buried here.
To know that people came here as kids, and died.
For Spellman, this became personal, and suddenly he had more questions than answers.
That's the census.
In 1830.
Nancy Bobbitt is president of the Vance County Historical Society.
So many old cemeteries like that get bulldozed, but because Ken so faithfully looked and found that cemetery and preserved it, it will last for another few generations. It's growing up with a tree root.
Bobbitt and her colleagues paid Spellman a visit, sharing documents from the Granville County Library. The census records, maps, photos, and copies of newspaper articles from the 1800s provided information about the Wortham family who owned this property for more than 100 years. Census records from the 1830s show, at the time, the family owned 15 slaves. It also revealed the family lived in Warren County. But 50 years after this survey, a section of Warren County was given up to help form Vance County, where the property sits today. And then there's this article from March of 1893, which says investigators were working a case after the owner, George Wortham, found a mulatto infant buried in a soapbox in his family cemetery. This is what the Wortham family cemetery looks like today. Each grave has a marker or headstone of some sort. And then there's these 2 stones, just like those buried at the gravesite for the enslaved.
Nobody knew 100 and some years or 200 years later or whatever that it would be discovered that the black ancestors were here and the whites are there, but the mixed babies over there in the family cemetery.
What a find in Henderson. Akila is back for part 2 of this story tomorrow. You'll hear more about these slave burial grounds and why archaeologists believe there are more people buried there than we know.
Ken Spellman was left with several questions after uncovering a burial ground for the enslaved on his property. He started wondering about the place he now called home and the stories of the people who lived there more than a century before him.
They came in chains, 5- and 6-year-old kids, and worked in the fields until they were 70 and 80, and they were buried right there where I was standing.
The magnitude of what happened here in Vance County is not lost on Ken Spellman. A graveyard for enslaved people is within steps of his home on Satterwhite Point Road. The trees surrounding the area holding on to secrets of the past.
They would talk about the struggle They would talk about the injustices.
It's a story UNC Chapel Hill archaeologist Dr. Anna Agby Davies says can be told through the old trees standing here and uneven ground.
They were laid out in fairly orderly rows, so these are not stones that were accidentally placed there. Some human put them there for a reason, and certainly marking the last resting place.
Although there are nearly 60 stones visible, she says it's possible many more people are buried here. Even these cabins paint a picture of the past. Dr. Agby Davies says you can trace the history of a structure like this through the changes made to it over time.
Some of the hardware, like the nails, are very typical of what you would see in the pre-emancipation era. And then some of the elements, some of the repairs show that people were continuing to use and maintain these buildings. That's why they're still standing.
She says they could have been multi-purpose units, used for storage, or even cabins for the enslaved. Inside, artifacts fill the shelves, from glass medicine bottles to this all-cast iron clothes iron, and tobacco receipts from the 1800s. Many of the items here were found in the enslaved gravesite, and Dr. Agby Davies says they were intentionally placed there as offerings. Relics of the past are littered throughout the 16 acres of land, including inside the Wortham family home. The family owned the property for more than 100 years. Many days, Spellman can't help but draw parallels between those who were enslaved here and his rocky past, serving 19 years in prison. While there, he created a program aimed at educating inmates and keeping them out of prison.
The officers even noticed that some of the young men that were going to segregation, they were not going to segregation any longer. Some of these young men were sitting down studying for their GEDs.
He believes this second chance at freedom was his purpose, and that buying the land allowed him to preserve the legacy of the enslaved men, women, and children who once called this place home.
We're actually freeing the spirits of those people that were in bondage here.
Akila Davis, ABC 11, Eyewitness.